If you just joined us, please just bear with us for a moment. We'll give about 30 seconds for everyone else to join us. Okay, let's begin. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the U.S.-China Relations Panel, the opening session of the China Conference here at Harvard Kennedy School, in partnership with the Center for China and Globalization and China-U.S. Exchange Foundation. My name is Leo Liu, an MPA candidate here at Harvard Kennedy School. Today, we are graced by the presence of two experts on Sino-American relations from either side of the Pacific who will discuss the state of U.S.-China relations and help us understand its future. Throughout the discussion, if you have a question that you'd like to address to our panelists, please submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll relay your questions as we go along. Next, let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Professor Graham Allison. Professor Allison is the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard University. He was the founding dean of Harvard Kennedy School, and until 2017, served as director of this Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, which is ranked as the #1 university-affiliated think tank in the world. Professor Allison has also served in key positions in the U.S. government, including as Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration and as Special Advisor to Secretary of Defense under President Reagan. Professor Allison has written many best-selling books on international relations. His latest work is Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides Trap, published in 2017, a topical and important issue that we're going to talk about today. Professor Allison, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Dr. Wang Huiyao. Dr. Wang is the founder and president of Center for China and Globalization, a leading Chinese non-governmental think tank that ranked among top 80 think tanks in the world. Dr. Wang is also an advisor to the Chinese government, having been appointed as counselor for China's State Council by the Chinese Premier in 2015. Dr. Wang is a thought leader on China and globalization, global governance, global trade and investment, global migration and talent flows, China's international relations, and China-U.S. trade relations. Dr. Wang, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Leo.
So let's begin. This year is the 50th anniversary of Nixon's visit to China. It was a watershed moment in history, which marked the beginning of the normalization of relations between the US and China after over 20 years of mutual hostility. In those 50 years, the Cold War has ended, the world economy has grown 21-fold from less than $4 trillion to $85 trillion in 2020. The US has helped China join the WTO. China has developed
Nixon to China 50 years ago this month. And I've talked to him about it often after. So this was advertised by the Nixon administration as the, quote, week that shook the world. And they were recalling Napoleon's counsel, in which he said, let China sleep, because when it awakes, it will shake the world. So I would say Napoleon was correct. China has awakened, it has shaken, and the world is still shaking with more to come. And interestingly, in the final year of his life, as I describe in my Destined for War book, Nixon came to have some second thoughts, just wondering, what had I done? And he said, was it possible that we awakened Frankenstein's monster? That we've created something that's going to be bigger and perhaps even hostile to us. So he was thinking about that question. And I think that it's very appropriate for in a setting like this to try to think back on the 50 years, to note what remarkable things have happened over those years for the world's benefit, for China's benefit, for America's benefit, but to also notice that that was then and this is now.
Dr. Wang?
Yes, thank you, Leo. And it's great to see Graham again. You are such a great thought leader, in the contemporary China-US relation and also geopolitics. So glad to see you again. Also, my professor, at Harvard Kennedy School a number of years ago. So I think that what Graham said is really a great recall of this historical a landmark event actually happened exactly 50 years ago. And I think that that impact still being felt. I mean, that we have led to a half a century global normalization, globalization, and prosperity. And I think now in China, just last week, there was a big celebration of Shanghai Communique, which has been established for the last 50 years. So I think this is really important. And it's a really a great event that will go down history, that sailed stability and prosperity for the last half century. So what I think the wisdom of Nixon and Kissinger half a century ago should probably be revisited. Now we have this crisis at Ukraine, and so I hope that people can see that China actually for the last half a century is very largely contributed to the global stability and prosperity. It become the second largest trade nation in the world, second largest economy in the world, and the largest trading nation in the world. And I think there's many things that China, US can continue the spirit of Shanghai Communique, and also to really be more a bit normal situation than we're currently in, which I think we are having quite a bit challenges and difficulties now.
Yeah, just following up on Dr. Wang's points, I think many would say that Shanghai Communique was one of the lasting legacies of Nixon's visits, which really laid out some core principles for US-China engagement and touched on many issues such as Taiwan, but also on Vietnam, India, Japan, and the Korean Peninsula. Do you think that these principles are still relevant today? Let me begin with Dr. Wang.
Well, I think that the principle is still relevant today, highly relevant. I mean, for example, in the Shanghai Communique, it said, we should seek the peace and security of the Pacific region, and also that in Taiwan, actually, both U.S. and China recognize Taiwan is a part of China, basically. And so those are really key fundamental principles. And also, they were actually, seeking not actually to interfere or actually disrupt the region, because I think U.S. and China has a great responsibility for that. So I think the Shanghai Communique is still quite, still very relevant today. I mean, basically has laid a foundation for the peace and security for the last half a century, I suppose. And I think that we have to continue some of that fundamental principles. But I think we can, of course, upgrade. I mean, we could have another Sino-US communique based on the past three communiques, I think. But still, I think we should really respect the Shanghai Communique and subsequently two communiques we had between China and the US.
Professor Allison?
I largely agree with Dr. Wang. I think the Shanghai Communique identified some fundamental foundations for the establishment of relations between the US and China. And they were largely a reiteration of the foundations, the foundational concepts in the UN Charter that China continues repeating, but they deserve to be repeated. They are called sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, non-interference in internal affairs. These are principles that the UN Charter laid down, but that are reflected in the Shanghai Communique. The biggest add in terms of the relationship between China and the US was the proposition that there's one China, that the parties on both sides of the strait agree on that proposition, and that ultimately, as we saw then with normalization of relations, that Beijing is the capital of that China. I think the difficulty has been that as the decades have gone on, and the circumstances have changed in China, and the circumstances have changed in Taiwan, and the circumstances have changed to some extent in the US and the world, the Shanghai Communique needs to be substantially upgraded and revised. And I would say that would be a great undertaking for the Biden and Xi administration going forward. And I don't think it's simply enough to restate what the Shanghai Communique stated, but to try to take account of the new realities in all three countries.
Thank you, Professor. So many people in the West, including pundits and academics, have described the current state of Sino-American relationship, as Professor Allison has mentioned, it has changed as the beginning of a new Cold War. While the Chinese media has generally refrained from such narrative and the Chinese government has actively rejected this so-called Cold War mentality, do you think that this new Cold War characterization is accurate? Let me begin with Professor Allison.
Well, the answer is, unfortunately, I'm a professor, so it's complicated, okay? And the answer is yes and no, okay? But if I had to choose just one, I would say no. So let me explain briefly. Is the relationship between the US and China a rivalry that's basically captured, I think, appropriately by Thucydides in his description of what happens in a competition between two states when the seesaw of power on which they're sitting is rapidly shifting. So that initially I'm competing with you, in which I look down on you or up on you, depending on where the seesaw is, and all of a sudden it's moving at the same time. So this Thucydidean rivalry I describe in the book, I think that's the best diagnosis of the problem that we face. So I take that to be the reality of the situation. But at the same time, the US and China live on a small planet in which both have superpower nuclear arsenals and in which both emit greenhouse gases into the same constrained biosphere, and therefore in which either of them by themselves can ruin the world for both itself and the other. So we're basically inseparable, conjoined Siamese twins, if you want to sort of a metaphor. And however hostile I may feel towards my competitor, however deserving he may be of being strangled, if I were to ever yield to this temptation and one strangled the other, it would be committing suicide at the same time. So you look at that and you say, I have a vital national interest in my survival, which requires my finding a way to coexist with you, even while at the same time I'm engaged in a fierce rivalry with you. So I would say that's the description of our problem and the reason why it's quite different from the Cold War, because the idea that there might be a new economic Iron Curtain in which the US is on one side and everybody else will join the US and China is on the other side makes no sense, since China is the major trading partner of everybody. China is a backbone of the global economy. So while there are some similarities between the competition between US and China, similarities with what we experienced in the Cold War, the differences are also huge, in particular, the economic difference.
Thank you. Dr. Wang?
Yes, I agree with Graham. I think that probably we can't categorize this as a Cold War. I really remember well last year around same time, at this time, we had a dialogue with Graham, and he has put forward his famous, inseparable conjoined twins. That is really, I think, a great phrase to reflect the reality. I noticed that Prime Minister of Singapore actually cited this phrase in the New Economy Conference just last November. So I think it's true. I think when you say Cold War at that time, when made it means Soviet Union against Eastern Bloc of countries and Western Bloc countries, but then the economic, the people-to-people exchanges, tourism, student exchanges. For example, during the Cold War, there's no student from China study in the U.S. Now you have, 500,000 almost study there. So the tourism, the economics scale, the trade volume, this world is totally connected. So somehow, of course, there's some decoupling on the tech side, but even that I think is hurting the consumers, hurting the business, and hurting the country. So we don't know. I mean, we have to see how that going to partial decoupling is going to survive. But we really hope that we need to strengthen the global governance, and then U.S. and China and EU maybe you can find a way to work together, and then really to have a normal acceptance of each other, and then we can make this world a much a better place for the 7.9 billion people in this world.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. And I want to follow up on both of your descriptions of the US-China relations as inseparable conjoined twins. But meanwhile, as Dr. Wang has just mentioned, the two countries have begun to decouple in some respects, like American companies pulling out of China in recent years. So in your opinion, to what extent are the countries separable? In what aspects can they separate? And to what extent are they not? Let me begin with Professor Allison.
So the term decoupling kind of resonates. And when Trump began to talk about it, the press actually, amplifies it. But if you look at the reality, the trade between the US and China is thicker now than it was before we started decoupling. So in spite of, in fact, the trade war, we're back to the level of trade that we had before the war. Part of the reason for that is that Americans are consumers, and China is the world's most successful producer of consumer goods. So where are iPhones assembled? In China. Where do batteries for electronic vehicles come from? From China, or the elements from China, where we could go on down the list. So basically, the economic relationship has continued to thicken at the same time that there's been this pushback in certain areas, and there's some items, particularly advanced semiconductors, that the Trump administration denied China, that have had a big impact on some industries in China, though China is developing the capacity to manufacture its own semiconductors for most of the categories, not just the most advanced. But so I think that we'll end up with efforts to decouple certain arenas, or I would say to put a security fence around some items that have military or security applications, but those are very few. And then we'll have a lot of protectionism, which is what you can currently see unleashed in a good part, unfortunately, of the Biden Build Back Better program. And if you listen to the State of the Union speech last night, where the effort to manufacture things in the US that China can actually manufacture at half the price or 2/3 the price will simply mean paying more for the equivalent items. So figuring out a way in which the comparative advantages of the US in the goods and services dominance in manufacturing commodity products, not only that, but at least that, but those happen to be the things that end up filling up Walmart's and Target and Home Depot, and finding a way then to deal with what's inevitably been a trade deficit. That's a challenging item, and especially challenging in the politics of the two countries, and especially for the US. But I think going forward, because in the security arena, for sure, China and the US are conjoined Siamese twins, whom, if they were ever to have a nuclear war, would destroy each other. For sure, I would say in the climate space, unless they can find a way to constrain greenhouse gas emissions, they will both spoil the biosphere for both of us. And I think even in the economic arena, there's some analog of that we have yet to kind of work our way through.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Wang?
Yes, I think that Graham actually is correct. And, many areas you cannot really separate decouple. And some decoupled area is really probably driven by these geopolitical concerns of both sides, probably. But I can see actually, if we work together, we make a win-win. For example, the two largest company in the United States, like Apple. I mean, 90% of Apple phone was made in China, but it was, designed and the brand by technology provided by Apple. So that is a success story that China, United States work on the Apple phone, supply the rest of the world. And also Tesla, almost become the largest company in the world because they have the largest clean vehicle manufacturer here in Shanghai. So you see, that is really good examples how we can work together with this cooperation. But again, I can see now we're having really difficult time because the U.S. administration has actually put hundreds of Chinese companies, close to 700 now, to some kind of a entity or other watchable list. So that is really where that is hurting. I think we just had a book launched about a week ago on how multinationals, international chambers view this. They felt that was really not help, particularly from multinational point of view. So I think how we can really, the business community can help this out, because surveys, again, like recently the Economist Intelligence Unit has just had an event. I was speaking there. Then they had actually all the company, Fortune 500, most company in the Asia Pacific, is continue to invest, continue to look positively to this region. And then China's import-export investment all break record last year. So you see, still, I see there's a forces trying to decouple, but of course, there's also much larger positive forces wants to conjoin. I think that is really, we have to be careful now with this political crisis. I think there's even more so. We want to have a stabilized China, have a stabilized supply and cooperation with the rest of the world, particularly United States.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. I think those are all great points. And you've both mentioned both competition as well as cooperation. So I think technological competition has become one of the centerpieces of US-China engagement. But as Dr. Wang has just mentioned, when governments adopt protectionist policies, it is ultimately the consumers who will bear the cost. How can the US and China engage in the tech race without harming the consumers in both countries? Let me begin with Professor Allison again.
Well, good. Difficult question, so thank you. So, excuse me one second. We just concluded a report of our China working group at Harvard called The Great Technology Rivalry. And what this does is one of 5 reports on the Great Rivalry, which try to track the data on what's actually happened in the 21st century, just the last 21 years, in the rivalry between the US and China. And the bottom line for each of these chapters, and in particular for the technology report, is that a country that the US could not even find in our rearview mirror 21 years ago, because it was so far behind, we can't find in our rearview mirror today because it's either beside us or slightly ahead of us. So we look across the spectrum of technology, but then drill down on 6 frontier technologies: 5G, AI, quantum, synthetic biology. So you can look at this report. It's on the Belfer website. It's about 60 pages with a lot of footnotes and data. And basically what it shows is that China has made huge leaps forward in becoming a serious rival in almost every technological arena. So 5G is a particularly difficult, painful one for me. And I wrote a piece about it in the Wall Street Journal with Eric Schmidt a couple of weeks ago. So basically, a short version of the story is 3G was dominated by Europe. 4G, the US rolled out and created an environment in which then it was possible for people to invent things which we now think of as mobile and smartphones and social media and a bunch of Google Maps, Uber, lots of things that nobody could have even imagined before, when it was 3G. Well, 5G, the US advertises 5G. You cannot watch the football playoff games or anything else without being inundated, as you know. But actually, the service providers, this is a fake. I mean, the title of our article was America's 5G Deserves 5 Fs. And we do a comparison with China. And I say, if you buy an Apple smartphone that's 5G enabled, the only reason why that would be valuable to have in most of the US would be if you were going to go to the Olympics, to Beijing, where you would be able to downstream at 5 times 4G speeds. Whereas here, 5G has the same speeds as 4G, sometimes even slower. So this is a case where no blame for China. Good for China doing what it did and doing it successfully. Blame for US for not running faster and finding a way to do so. And so that's, a struggle. Now, competition is, at least in economics, a good thing. Competition in Olympics and athletics is a good thing. I run faster if I'm running against somebody, if I have a competitor, than I do when running alone. So how then to recognize the win-win component of constructive competition, but nonetheless at the same time recognize that at the end of the day, the party that wins the race, for example, in 5G, will have advantages economically and in security terms in their rivalry with the other competitor. So this is back to this contradiction again, that on the one hand, the competition can be constructive and positive and have benefits. At the same time, in a geopolitical rivalry where I would rather the rules for the internet be written by the US and my Chinese colleague might prefer them to be written by China, that's the competitive side of it. And I think we will have to be smart enough to hold these two contradictory impulses in our heads and in our guts at the same time and still function.
Thank you, Professor Allison. Dr. Wang?
Yes. I very much agree with what Graham has just said. I think this Olympic spirit, this athletic competition, which is healthy, absolutely. You run with somebody, you probably help you run faster. So that is a healthy competition. We really want to avoid this unhealthy competition. So I think Graham mentioned about 5G and those things. So because I think China was probably in some case competing with US and EU. Now China, for example, they built 4.6 4G stations. Now they have 1.4 million 5G stations. Well, every village now is Wi-Fi connected. So that's really helped the efficiency and the effectiveness of production and manufacturing and the whole society running in China. So I think infrastructure is really a great thing. I noticed that Graham's book, the latest report on technology, also mentioned about infrastructure. For example, China's speed railway have 2/3 of the global total length, which is enormous. And so,
it's okay.
So I'm
the
thinking,
US has zero. We have zero.
Yeah. Well, but so what I was thinking is that President Biden actually proposed infrastructure package of 1.2 trillion in the B3W, Build Back Better World, and the EU has proposed the 300 billion euro on infrastructure, and China has this infrastructure for the last 8 years on Belt and Road connectivity. So maybe we could, on this common thing, that common prosperity, we can work together with the US and the EU on the infrastructure so that we can really intertwine deeply so we can avoid the future conflict. So something like that, infrastructure. I had a talk with Larry Summers about a month ago. We talked about in length. He was thinking about the World Bank should be reinvigorated, and ADB, AIB, all the development banks should really work together for the probably we have another infrastructure transformation for the world, which is bad and needed. I think we need to find a common ground to work with each other.
Thank you, Dr. Wang.
If I can make one half frivolous comment. So I'm enamored of China's prowess in constructing infrastructure, and I'm appalled by American efforts. And if you want to get a vivid example of this, look at my TED Talk that was from 2017, in which I compare how long it took to renovate the Harvard Bridge between the Kennedy School and the Business School across the river, on the one hand, and the Sanyan Bridge in Beijing, which has twice the number of lanes of traffic. And you won't believe the answer, but I've got a timestamp video of the Chinese construction project. How long did it take before the traffic was flowing as compared to the Harvard one? So that's just for fun. And I would say, secondly, when Xi Jinping came to visit Donald Trump for his first visit at Mar-a-Lago, I made a proposal first to the Chinese, who didn't seem to like the idea, and then to Trump's crowd. They didn't like the idea either. So finally I said, well, it's probably tongue-in-cheek. I'll make it publicly. So I think I wrote a Time magazine piece about it. So I said, in the Chinese tradition, when the leader comes to visit, they bring presents. So oftentimes when they go to an African country, for example, they'll build a soccer stadium or something, something to be just a significant sign of appreciation. I said, well, Donald Trump was very keen about having a wall that would prevent illegal immigration from Mexico. So my proposal was that she would say to Trump, China likes walls. China actually has a long history with walls. We're very proud of one. We call it the Great Wall. So if you would like, we can construct a Great Wall for you right along the border with Mexico. I said, if they would do that, he would have Donald Trump as his closest buddy forever.
That's a great anecdote. Thank you, Professor Allison. So actually, that's a great segue to my next question, which is on infrastructure. Both the U.S. and China are pursuing infrastructure development. For Biden administration, it's Build Back Better. For China, it has continued to develop its infrastructure domestically, but also try to export it worldwide through its Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think that the U.S. and China have opportunities to collaborate on infrastructure development? This time, let me begin with Dr. Wang.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the Graham's anecdote is really, exemplified the need. I think there's complementary role that can be played. For example, I can give you a story, a case that I was speaking at the Council of Foreign Relations a few years back, and I was saying that the taxes, the oil, the energy from taxes inland, the cost of that to the shore, export that on ocean to China is double the cost. Inland cost is double the cost of ocean shipping cost. Why? Because there's no infrastructure inland. And actually, Michael Pillsbury was at the meeting, and he actually went back and verified that it was true, because there's no infrastructure in the inland Texas to really take a big advantage of this energy export. So I think that it's important that we actually have infrastructure. I think, as Graham said, there's zero, high-speed rail. Maybe we could help San Francisco to Los Angeles or Las Vegas to Los Angeles. There could be a short way of doing that. Absolutely, and also airports and infrastructure. I think we could probably start by having those helping U.S. export to China infrastructure, like I mentioned, the taxes. But also we have China has there's some underground company doing some project in Houston, also in Boston and Los Angeles. So I think there could be a way of doing that. Absolutely, but I think I see the big potential though is actually working in a third country, in a developed country where the U.S. has all the tradition, familiar with the religion and language and the laws and everything. China has all the capacity built up in the last several decades in big mega project. So I think they can really work together for both each other and for the world. I think there's a lot of potential to do. So how to have a global governance for that? I mean, World Bank, chaired by U.S., Asian Development Bank chaired by Japanese, and AIB chaired by China. Maybe the development banks should start first, because AIB also joined by many European countries, and that's a good vehicle to really start working on the infrastructure.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Professor Allison?
Well, I like Henry's thoughts. I think part of the problem is that there are probably 7 reasons why American infrastructure projects have been so slow and unsuccessful. And therefore, doing them in a cooperative or joint way with China is not necessarily going to make those better. Okay? Now, when I look at the effort to build a high-speed rail, we have one project that was supposed to go from Sacramento from LA to Sacramento. The governor couple of weeks ago. It started out, they were going to be finished in 5 years. So it cost, I think, $40 billion or 50. It's now 15 or 17 years later. They're not saying whenever it's going to be finished, if ever. And it has a $110 billion budget, so it hasn't been completed. Now, we'd take a long analysis to see what are all the things that are wrong with it. But if I try to pick up on Henry's point, maybe a silver lining would be, so could you imagine, so Elon Musk thinks he can do virtually anything. He's got one of these crazy ideas of boring holes underground, through which you would run either cars or trains and stuff. I don't know whether it makes any sense or not, but I could imagine him having a company which had both a Chinese and an American, component, and then going and drilling a hole from Los Angeles to Sacramento or from wherever to wherever. So I think the idea of maybe having some business people in the mix with companies, they're more pragmatic than the governments. And they basically, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So, but I think it's going to be a difficult area because it's an area in which American performance has been poor. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Allison. So I want to shift gears a little bit to the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Over the past week, the whole world's attention has been fixated on Ukraine. And as Russia invaded, the United States, as well as most of the European nations, have joined to condemn Putin for this act of war. But China has generally maintained its neutrality on this issue. So what do you think are the implications that this Russian-Ukraine conflict might have on U.S., China, and Russia-China relations? Let me begin with Professor Allison.
Okay, so again, this is another big subject, and one of the problems about professors is that, as one of my colleagues said, they speak in 50-minute sound bites. So I'll try to be brief. I wrote a piece, so I've written 2 pieces in the last 2 weeks about this for anybody who wants to read at greater length. So they're both in the national interest. The most recent one was last week, in which I said, or raised the question, will China have Putin's back in this invasion? And I said, my prediction is the answer is yes. Okay? The previous piece a couple of weeks ago said Washington was saying Putin's invasion was imminent and it was going to happen tomorrow, or Biden once said, told the leaders of Europe it was going to be on Wednesday. And I said, there's going to be no invasion of Ukraine before February 20. And I was taking 4-to-1 bets, $4 of my money against $1 of yours, with Washington people on this. I'm going to be in Washington tomorrow collecting some of my bets. Okay. So basically, the fundamental reason why there was not going to be an invasion before the closing ceremony of the Olympics is that Xi and China have built a relationship with Putin and Russia that is thick and operational. And even though it defies geopolitical gravity, since in principle, if you were just a Martian analyst, you would say China and Russia have many more reasons to be adversarial than to be allied. They have a lot of territory that used to be called China that's now called Russia, including a port that the Russians call Vladivostok, but on Chinese maps still have a Chinese name. Okay? They have a huge area in Siberia that has no people virtually, and is full of resources. On the other side of a border, you have a huge hundreds of millions of people and no oil and gas and other resources. So I can think of a solution to that problem. So then you go through the list and you say, how can the world, can two states that should naturally be antagonistic be as operationally aligned as they are? And I'd say there's two big factors. First is China's brilliant diplomacy, especially Xi's, in finding a way to court and coddle Putin, and even to make him feel comfortable as a junior partner without ever saying so. So who was the first person Xi visited when he became president? Putin. Whom did he spend their birthday with? Putin. Who's the first person that pops up at every Chinese meeting after Xi? Right? The first foreigner. Putin. Who's the first person he met with in person for 2 years? Foreign leader. There at the summit at the beginning of the Olympics, February 4. Putin. So Xi has done a great job of that. And secondly, the U.S. has in targeting both China and Russia as adversaries and trying to isolate the two of them, has missed the fact that the enemy of my enemy is a friend. That's Geopolitics 101. So as Spig Brzezinski pointed out, we've been pushing China and Russia closer together. Well, this is just the opposite of the trilateral diplomacy that we're remembering the 50th anniversary of now. So this is like Xi has learned the lesson better than Americans have. So I would say that as we watch what's now happening, China is stressed because what Russia is doing is blatantly contradicts China's fundamental principles for international relations. So China not only says, but I think the Chinese government believes in the foundations of the UN Charter, including sovereignty and territorial integrity. No one can deny that Russia's invasion, coming on the heels of it previously seizing Crimea, is not consistent with territorial integrity. So that's made the job of the foreign ministry very, very difficult. And you can see them been trying to figure out some path here. But at the same time, I argue in this piece that given China's interests and that where it has to make hard choices, it will have Putin's back. And so far, I think that's what we're observing. Now, one last point, I was interested that yesterday, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, had a conversation with the Ukrainian foreign minister, in which, according to the foreign ministry's account of the conversation, he said China was eager to play a role in helping to negotiate a ceasefire now and a resolution of these issues in which Ukraine would be a neutral state. So I think it's likely that we'll see more activity from China trying to play a role as a peacemaker in this space, because that way that'll soften the fact that at the same time it's protecting Putin's back, including in the vote today in the UN, in which it abstained rather than criticizing Russia for invading Ukraine.
Thank you, Professor Allison, for those great remarks. Dr. Wang, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. And I think Graham has certainly made a case that I think historically, China and Russia has a lot of difficulties, and Russia has taken big chunk of Chinese territories in a historical sense. But even as myself, I remember in the late 1960s, we almost broke a war out with the former Soviet Union. So it was really a relationship up and down. But I think recent years, the relationship has become very, very well. But I think that's probably also reflecting what Graham just said. I was actually pushed probably by U.S. and by Western countries that they to get a bit closer, because I think they share some kind of empathy to each other, because they all failed the sanctions and things like that. But what I think actually is, though, that China is different with Russia. But you remember last October when President Biden came to Beijing, he had a virtual summit with President Xi, was really very encouraging words that he's saying, U.S. is not seeking to change China. U.S. does not want to set up alliance against China. So the moment Biden goes back to Washington and said, okay, we're going to boycott the Olympics. And so it's a really big shock, surprise to the Chinese government and to its people. But then Putin comes out, say, okay, I'm going to come to the Beijing Olympic. I'm going to support Beijing. I'm going to come in a big way. And so that's where he came, and they have the big joint statement. But that statement, I think there's some misunderstanding. It should not be interpreted as some kind of alliance. China does not seek alliance with any other countries. It's not a military alliance. They just boldly laid out some of their views of the world, how the global governance, how they can cooperate, and things like that. So I think it's a bit overread of that statement. But again, as Graham said, we had Foreign Minister Wang Yi had the telephone call with Foreign Minister of Ukraine, and then China stated very clear that Ukraine sovereignty should be respected, as also Mr. Wang Yi said, the Munich Security Conference. So I think absolutely, it would be great. I think China can do something, because China, if you look at a country that has both good relation with Ukraine and the Russian, you probably wouldn't find the second most influential country in the world to have that position. So China could use that position, because China also has a vital interest with European countries. Ukraine is a signing party to the Belt and Road Initiative. China has 16+1 initiative. The continental, speed rail, the train cargo actually has gone up 50 times for China and European continental train shipment. So there's vital interest for China to see the security and the prosperity in Europe as well. So and also China is the largest trading partner with Europe as well. So again, I think it would be great if China is invited to the table, and then use its goodwill to really make sure this conflict is not escalated, and de-escalate that. And China certainly can play much role there.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. I think the Ukrainian crisis has certainly shown us that even though that both U.S. and China are third parties, they can't really avoid each other in a globalized world. So I think still following up on the global issues. There are many other global issues, such as climate change, pandemics, and nuclear non-proliferation, that require collaboration from both countries. Can the two countries find ways to collaborate in spite of substantial differences? Professor Allison?
Well, I would say survival is a very powerful, sturdy imperative. Nations rarely, or sane leaders of nations rarely commit suicide for their country. You can probably find some examples, but it's a very, very, very rare. So if sane leaders of China and the US, and I think we have quite sane leaders in both Biden and Xi, look at the world and say, what's happening if there should be a nuclear war between the two of us? They quickly get to the right conclusion. Bad idea. Okay. If they look at the climate challenge over the long run, they can see that either party by itself on the current trajectory can emit so much greenhouse gas that the whole biosphere will become unlivable for everybody. So, bad idea. Pandemics, interesting. So the prospect of having impermeable walls around the country to prevent 100% of the penetration by viruses losing battle. That doesn't mean that the Chinese strategy for trying to find cases when they occur and limit their spread, actually it's turned out to have been, I would say, certainly more successful than the American strategy. But it still is not a zero world. Pandemic or viruses and bacteria will get through borders. They don't observe borders. So again, shared interest in trying to prevent that or find ways to deal with it. And I think in the nuclear proliferation, we're seeing this with the Iranian negotiations that are going on right now. China and the US recognize neither have an interest in Iran becoming a nuclear weapon state. So what can they do? So I think there are many areas like that that should motivate two rational countries to find ways to cooperate in spite of the fact that we'll be competitive at the same time.
Thank you, Professor Allison. Dr. Wang?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Graham. I think that important that being the largest and the second largest economy in the world, and also with the increasing influence, I mean, all those global challenges, we need a global leadership and global multilateralism to really thrive. So I think it's important that now US is running thing on many of those global governance issues, and China could really help and be supportive. I really think those are common area like climate change, like the cyber security, and also all the other infrastructure needs of the world and things like that, poverty alleviation, SDG 2030 agenda. I mean, it's really need a lot of common efforts, but most important, leadership. So I think China and the US has a moral responsibility to really to work on that, and then so that we can really get away from this geopolitical attention somewhat and put more emphasis on the on those common prosperity, common good for the world. And then really that is really important. I think we should work towards that. And that's really, I think I'm really encouraged by the dialogue we have today.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. I know that our time is almost up, but I just have one last question. What are your hopes for the next 50 years of US and China relations, since we have commemorated the past 50 years in the beginning of this webinar? Let me begin with Professor Allison.
Well, I don't think anybody would have imagined 50 years ago the China that exists today. If you had told Kissinger and Nixon that China would have become a full-scale peer competitor of the US in one of their lifetimes, they would have said, you're out of your mind. Okay, not conceivable. So what China has accomplished in just basically 2 generations is quite amazing. And I think I expect that the next 50 years will be equally amazing, for China, for the US, and for the world. So I think the main task for both the US and China, in my view, is to find a way to escape Thucydides Trap. So we should study history carefully and recognize that even though there were a lot of benefits to Germany and Great Britain in the period from, the 1880s right through to 1914, and even though they were both each other's most important trading partner, they were both heavily invested in each other. They both exchanged a lot of students who were educated in the other country. Actually, the two leaders of the country were cousins. Okay, so they were relatives, and they celebrated holidays together. Nonetheless, when you have a rising power seriously threatening to displace a ruling power, you find a syndrome that we've seen repeatedly in history since Athens rose to challenge Sparta. And mostly those turn out catastrophically. So I fear that this will go the way of history. And if it doesn't, it won't be because we were complacent or we took it for granted. We just said war couldn't happen. It'll be because statesmen reach beyond history as usual, beyond diplomacy as usual, beyond strategic imagination as usual. So they have to stretch to some, better ideas. And I think that's why it's a good thing to have conferences like this where folks who are your age are more likely to be less constrained by the concepts and practices that people of my generation have, may be able to think of some better ideas. So I would say, over to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Allison. Dr. Wang?
Yes, thank you. And I agree with Graham that, so we really have to avoid this Thucydides trap and really not let a catastrophic outcome. I think, from now to the next 50 years, we really has to be, it's the wisdom of humankind is really at the test. I think now with the modern technology, with a global village, we're now actually in the same boat as I was talking to Kishore Mahbubani. He was saying there's an ocean, there's 193 cabinets rather than 193 boats floating around separately. We are actually, in the same boat. So how can we get the boat culture, with this modern technology, modern integration, so that we can accept each other? That's really, I think, a huge task in the future, about acceptance. I mean, things like we have the idea of a democracy. We both had events on democracy in Washington and Beijing, but how we can see the effectiveness of democracy. We also now practice human rights, but let's see, can we attach human rights to the SDG 17 criteria to match the human rights? So I think it would be some kind of conversion of the values, I think, in the next 50 years, so we can avoid a conflict. And also, again, that I was talking to Joseph Naib just at the same time last year. He was saying by 2035, maybe China and US will reach a new equilibrium, and then maybe we will see some common understanding. And probably by 2049, I'm thinking that, Fukuyama, this end of history may not be ending, and we really can find a way to commonly live with each other and understand each other. Because of the modern technology, so much tied everybody together, we got to come up with a global culture that recognizable by all the countries, so that we don't go to the war to make our difference. So I really think that prosperity, the modernization, and can change the human being nature somehow, that we really can live together in the next half a century. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. And on that high note, we end our conference today, but still tuning in to our future sessions. We want to extend our utmost appreciation to both Professor Graham Allison, Dr. Wang Huiyao, for being our panelists today. And thank you for joining us here. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.